The atmosphere inside the Supreme Court chamber was thick with unease long before the first raised voice echoed across its hallowed floors. The National Judicial Reform Summit had drawn the nation's most powerful figures under one roof, but what was meant to be a ceremonial gathering quickly began to crack under the pressure of political tension. It wasn't long before quiet whispers turned into sharpened glances, and sharpened glances morphed into a war of ideals. Among the first to break the thin layer of civility were Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett. Their disagreement began subtly, a difference in interpretation over a proposed reform aimed at limiting federal judges' ability to override executive orders. What should have been a calm legal debate swiftly evolved into a personal, fiery exchange. Crockett, armed with passion and disdain for what she saw as overreach from the executive branch, challenged the legality of the proposal. Bondi, defending the administration's authority, countered with firm conviction, pointing fingers at what she claimed was a judiciary that had abandoned neutrality. The two women didn't just disagree on policy, they clashed over the very soul of the legal system. As the room grew more agitated, it became clear that this summit would not follow the sterile ceremonial script that had been prepared. Tension bubbled from every corner, and it was only a matter of time before the center of the storm revealed itself. That center, unmistakably, was Trump. He had entered the summit unannounced, not as a guest speaker, but as a man with a score to settle. The recent judicial ruling that struck down one of his controversial deportation orders had not only embarrassed his administration, it had, in his view, insulted the will of the American people. With the weight of that frustration pressing down on him, Trump walked in, ignored the shocked murmurs, and made his way to the center of the chamber. For a moment, everything froze. The heated murmurs between Bondi and Crockett were cut off mid-sentence. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, seated stoically at the head of the long oak table, looked momentarily uncertain of what would come next. Trump didn't wait for introductions or permissions. He spoke directly, his voice commanding the room, framing the judiciary not as a balance of power, but as an obstacle, one that had repeatedly blocked the path he claimed was carved out by voters. John Roberts, known for his calm temperament, did not take kindly to the accusations. His eyes narrowed, and a rare sternness overtook his usually measured demeanor. When he responded, he did so not with anger, but with cold, institutional force. He defended the judiciary's role as the final check, the protector of the Constitution, not a servant to political tides. But Trump wasn't there for a lecture in civics. He was there for war. The two men stared each other down. It wasn't just a clash of egos, it was a clash between two philosophies of power, one rooted in democratic order and restraint, the other fueled by populist urgency and raw defiance. Around them, the room dissolved into chaos. Bondi, now standing, doubled down on her support for Trump's position, while Crockett rose to counter her again, this time with greater intensity. What began as a legal conference was now a live political battlefield, with lines being drawn in real time. Media crews outside the chamber, once prepared for a bland string of speeches, were now rushing to capture every tremor of this political earthquake. Inside, staffers began whispering to each other in alarm, while security inched closer, uncertain whether they were witnessing a policy dispute or the early stages of something much more disruptive. What made it even more shocking was how personal it all felt. These weren't abstract debates. The voices were raw, the gestures emphatic, and the stakes visible on every face. As Crockett slammed a folder on the table to emphasize her point, Bondi responded by dragging past rulings into the discussion that painted the judiciary as having a partisan agenda. The Chief Justice attempted to call for order, but his gavel might as well have been a whisper in a storm. The confrontation between Trump and Roberts was no longer theoretical. Trump stepped closer to the Chief Justice, his expression unreadable, but his body language loud. Roberts, unshaken, stood to meet him. The room quieted for a moment, not out of respect but anticipation. Something irreversible was about to happen, and no one in the chamber could look away. Trump's presence at the summit was now a seismic shift, turning every participant into either a witness or a combatant. The distance between him and Chief Justice Roberts evaporated the moment they locked eyes. The room, once grand and orderly, now simmered with an energy that belonged more to a battlefield than a bench of law. The silence that had fallen after their initial clash didn't last. It gave way to a storm of interruptions, rebuttals, and gestures that grew more desperate by the second. Pam Bondi, emboldened by Trump's arrival, pushed her argument louder, stronger. She wasn't just defending policy anymore. She was calling into question the very foundation of judicial power. Jasmine Crockett, visibly shaking with fury, didn't flinch. She countered not with political language, but with deeply human stories, moments that illustrated what unchecked executive authority had done to real lives. Every time Bondi invoked the Constitution as a shield for presidential authority, Crockett brought it back as a sword for protection of the people. Their dispute, while personal, had grown into a symbolic war between two versions of America. Meanwhile, Trump turned fully toward the Chief Justice, laying bare years of accumulated resentment. He didn't just question Roberts' rulings. He tore into the culture of judicial independence, painting it as a smokescreen for elitism and corruption. The implication was clear. The courts, in Trump's eyes, no longer served the nation. They served themselves. Roberts, rising with a calm that betrayed the fire behind his gaze, held his ground. He did not meet Trump's rage with equal fury. Instead, he presented an icy form of resistance, speaking with the cadence of a man defending, not just his bench, but the centuries of order it represented. And yet, the air around him cracked with tension, because for all his poise, he knew that this wasn't just about law. It was about legitimacy. The chamber descended into louder turmoil as Roberts pushed back against Trump's declarations. Across the room, legal scholars, clerks, and policy advisors turned to each other in disbelief. The summit had become a reckoning. Lines of loyalty were drawn on the floor like fault lines, those who sided with Bondi and Trump, and those who stood with Crockett and Roberts. There was no in-between anymore. A sudden outburst from Bondi reignited the fire between her and Crockett, this time with security guards moving closer. The two women had moved beyond legal sparring. Bondi accused the judiciary of shielding criminals under the guise of civil liberties, while Crockett fired back with the names of innocent people caught in bureaucratic webs spun by executive orders. Their words shot across the room like shrapnel, and no one remained untouched. Staffers tried to intervene, but neither woman would back down. Crockett's voice, raw with emotion, struck something in the room that made even the most hardened officials sit up straighter. Trump watched the chaos like a conductor measuring the sound of his orchestra. It was clear he believed the disruption served him. The judiciary was on the defensive. Roberts, despite his authoritative tone, was surrounded by disorder that symbolically undermined the power he tried to preserve. But then something happened that Trump did not anticipate. Roberts abandoned the formal posture and descended from the bench. His voice dropped, but the weight behind his words only grew. He recited rulings, referenced cases, and laid bare moments in American history when the judiciary had saved the nation from the very type of unfiltered power Trump now wielded. The chamber didn't quiet out of respect this time. It quieted out of reflection. For a flicker of a second, the walls of the Supreme Court remembered what they were built for. That second didn't last. Trump stepped closer again, this time, furious that his message was losing ground. He interrupted, demanded, redirected. His words painted the judiciary as complicit in national decay, corrupt in its silence, and cowardly in its refusal to act with the will of the people. The two men now stood nearly chest to chest, the room breathless. Neither was going to blink. Outside, the media had picked up the noise. Reporters clustered on the steps of the Supreme Court, their broadcasts flooded with phrases like constitutional crisis and historic confrontation. Crowds began forming, not as protesters or supporters, but as citizens, watching something none of them had ever expected to see. Two of the most powerful figures in American life, reducing centuries of government protocol to smoldering ash. Inside, Crockett had finally stepped away from Bondi, not out of surrender but to address Trump directly. Her voice was firm, full of moral rage, and it struck the heart of the chamber. Bondi tried to shout over her, but even she could see the tide shifting. The arguments had reached their peak. The room, filled with raw humanity and deep divisions, was now on the edge of collapse. And then, in a final escalation, Trump turned not just on Roberts, but on the entire bench. He called into question past rulings, judicial appointees, and even the sacredness of the Constitution itself. It was no longer a disagreement. It was war on the institution. The Chief Justice, for the first time, looked visibly shaken, not afraid, but saddened. Not by Trump's words, but by how many in the room nodded along. The room had become a mirror of a fractured nation. Every stare, every clenched jaw, every movement carried the weight of ideologies on the verge of collision. Pam Bondi remained firmly aligned with Trump, her presence like a battle standard, waving defiantly in a courtroom that once prided itself on impartiality. Jasmine Crockett, though clearly exhausted, refused to waver. Her voice now represented not just dissent, but resistance, a voice for those who had long felt trampled by unchecked executive force. And yet it was Chief Justice John Roberts who stood at the crossroads of the chaos. Surrounded by the very symbols of justice he had sworn to uphold, he now had to decide whether he would defend them with words or action. Trump's accusations had cut deep, not just because of their fury, but because of how effectively they resonated with some in the chamber. The suggestion that the judiciary had become an elite circle, far removed from the struggles of ordinary citizens, had landed with more power than Roberts had expected. And that was what shook him. Not the anger, but the fact that it found roots. Trump saw the hesitation. He pushed harder, challenging the court's recent rulings and questioning whether any of them had truly served the public good. He painted a picture of a country drowning in bureaucracy while the judiciary stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, immune to the pain in the streets. It was a populist blade aimed at the heart of institutional power, and Trump wielded it with ruthless precision. Roberts took a breath. His next move would not be about defending tradition. It would be about defending reality. He stepped forward, now speaking not just to Trump, but to everyone present. His tone was no longer cold and rehearsed. It was heavy with disappointment. He acknowledged mistakes, recognized the times the courts had fallen short, but he warned of what comes when law becomes optional. The consequences of chaos are never abstract when they reach your doorstep. But Trump wasn't there for logic. He was there for dominance. He interrupted again, pulling every thread of populist anger he could find, highlighting how courts had failed veterans, failed businesses, failed families. He motioned to Bondi, who eagerly supplied statistics and personal stories that gave his arguments a powerful emotional pull. For a moment it seemed like Roberts would lose control entirely, and that's when Crockett returned to the center of the room. She didn't yell. She didn't posture. She simply told a story. It was about a child separated from their mother under an executive order, about how that case had landed in court, about how the judiciary had reunited them. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise like thunder. Bondi tried to dismiss it as anecdotal. Trump waved it off as emotional manipulation. But Crockett kept going, layering one human example after another, until even those who had aligned themselves with Trump began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Chief Justice saw the moment and seized it. He called for the summit to return to its agenda, not as a way to escape the confrontation, but to reassert that law, for all its flaws, was still standing. But Trump refused to sit. His refusal was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that he would not abide by Roberts' authority. It was then that Bondi, sensing that momentum might slip away, leaned into Trump's narrative with everything she had. She demanded the judiciary publicly review its own procedures and passed decisions in front of the nation. A televised audit, she said, to prove the courts had nothing to hide. Crockett exploded at the suggestion, calling it an attack on judicial independence disguised as transparency. The two women were now in a standoff that no moderator could contain. Trump watched them with an expression that blended satisfaction and calculation. He had cracked open the court, and now its defenders were struggling to patch the fissures. The media outside had swelled into a circus, drones buzzing overhead, analysts speculating breathlessly. Inside, the summit had broken into separate camps. Judges, senators, legal scholars, and aides all picking sides, glancing nervously toward Trump or Roberts, trying to determine who still held the reins of control. The room began to empty in pockets, but the confrontation at the front continued to intensify. Roberts stood tall, but a deeper fatigue had crept into his features. He saw the damage, felt it in the air. Trust had been poisoned. The chamber was no longer neutral ground. It was a stage, and everyone in it an actor in a national drama that would not be resolved by a ruling or a vote. And just when it seemed the moment might descend into irreversible collapse, Trump raised his hand, not in surrender, but in command. He called for a full judicial overhaul, citing the will of the people and the alleged betrayal of democracy. He wasn't asking for debate. He was demanding obedience. The silence that followed was suffocating. As the silence settled, thick and absolute, every person in the chamber understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered for decades. The air was still, yet it crackled with a sense of irreversible change. Trump's demand for a complete judicial overhaul didn't land like a proposal. It landed like a verdict. No discussion, no room for dissent, only the expectation of compliance. He stood unmoved, daring anyone to oppose him. The weight of his words had shifted the power dynamic of the room, but that shift came at a cost no one had yet fully calculated. John Roberts stood motionless, staring directly at Trump. He wasn't just looking at a man, but at the manifestation of an ideology that treated restraint as weakness and saw tradition as a tool to be dismantled. And in that moment, Roberts decided to speak not as a Chief Justice, but as a citizen of the very democracy he had spent his life upholding. He stepped forward, calm yet firm, and made it clear that no branch of government, no matter how revered or powerful, could claim absolute authority. He did not plead, he did not argue. He stated facts, a closing statement to a case that had never been called to order, but had consumed the court nonetheless. And this time when he spoke, the room actually listened, not out of fear, but out of a buried recognition that if the judiciary crumbled, so too would the thin fabric holding the nation together. Trump stared him down, but he could feel something shifting. The people in the room were no longer clapping, no longer leaning forward in anticipation of his next proclamation. There were no cheers, no nods of affirmation, just silence. And in that silence, power began to recede from him, not by force, but by absence. The spotlight dimmed. Jasmine Crockett, sensing the moment, turned to Bondi. The heat between them had not cooled, but it had changed shape. Crockett didn't need to yell now. She simply asked the question that had been echoing in the minds of everyone watching. Who benefits when the system breaks? The question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Bondi opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. She looked at the Chief Justice, then at Trump, then finally at the crowd around her, and for the first time, her certainty faltered. It wasn't a surrender, but it was no longer defiance either. It was something in between, a space where doubt had crept in. Outside the chamber, the news had already spread like wildfire. Headlines blared about Trump's demand, Roberts' resistance, and the historic confrontation that now stood as a defining moment in modern political history. Protesters began gathering not out of partisanship, but out of confusion, fear, and a longing for clarity. Something had shifted in the national consciousness. Back inside, Roberts did something no one expected. He turned his back on Trump, not out of disrespect, but as a statement that the debate was over. He walked back to his seat, not with the swagger of victory, but with the quiet authority of a man who had faced the abyss and chosen to stand firm. His refusal to engage further stripped the moment of its tension, and slowly the temperature in the room began to drop. Trump remained at the center, hands folded, watching as the moment slipped from his grasp. For the first time during the summit, he looked less like a disruptor and more like a man searching for the fire that had burned so brightly minutes ago. But it was gone, replaced by a courtroom that had remembered what it was for. Pam Bondi sat, down, jaw tight. Jasmine Crockett stepped back, her shoulders heavy but her resolve unshaken. There were no speeches, no gavel to bring closure, no headlines to write the ending. The confrontation had burned itself out, leaving behind not a resolution, but a reckoning. And then it happened. Roberts stood once more, not to argue, not to retaliate, but to announce the return of the summit's original agenda. It was a small act, procedural and dull on the surface, but it was the clearest message of all. The court would go on. It would not be ruled by emotion, nor hijacked by spectacle. It would endure. Trump, realizing the moment had slipped beyond recovery, finally turned and walked out. No words, no gestures, just the sound of his footsteps echoing off the marble floors as cameras snapped behind him. Outside, the press scrambled, pundits speculated, and the country watched. Inside, Roberts remained standing, his expression unreadable, but the message unmistakable. Power had come knocking, loud and angry, but it had not taken the court with it. The nation had been shown the edge, but it had not fallen.